Fannie Lou Hamer, The Voice That Could Not Be Silenced. Chapter 1, Seeds in Sacred Soil. Picture a little girl with wide, curious eyes standing on the porch of a weathered wooden shack in 1923. 6-year-old Fannie Lou gazes at the rising sun painting the cotton fields golden, stretching endlessly toward the horizon like a white ocean frozen in time. Today, her childhood ends. Mama says she's old enough to help the family pick cotton. The morning air is crisp with autumn promise, carrying the sweet scent of cotton bolls ready for harvest. Fanny's bare feet feel the rough wooden planks beneath them, worn smooth by decades of her family's footsteps. She can hear her 19 older brothers and sisters stirring inside the 2-room shack that houses them all, their voices a gentle murmur, mixed with Mama's humming of an old spiritual. Those tiny fingers, small enough to slip between the cotton plants without damaging the precious crop, quickly learn to separate the white bolls from the prickly stems. The work is methodical, almost meditative. Reach, pluck, stuff into the long canvas sack dragging behind her. Her back aches from constant bending, and the Mississippi sun beats down mercilessly. But little Fanny doesn't complain. She knows the family needs every penny to survive. The Townsend family picks cotton for Mr. W.D. Marlowe, who owns the land stretching as far as the eye can see. Like countless black families across the Mississippi Delta, they live under the sharecropping system, a cruel arrangement that kept them perpetually in debt despite their back-breaking labor. Papa James could pick 300 pounds of cotton on a good day, Mama Luella nearly as much. But somehow, the numbers in Mr. Marlowe's ledger books never seem to add up in their favor. In the evenings, when the sacks are full and her hands are scratched bloody from the sharp stems, Fanny sits on the porch beside Mama, listening to her wise words while the cicadas sing their evening song. The porch is their sanctuary, a place where dreams could still live despite the harsh realities of their daily existence. "Remember, my child," says Luella, her voice soft but firm as she strokes her daughter's cornrowed hair. "You're just as much a human being as anybody else on this earth. Your skin might be dark and your dress might be patched, but your soul is pure and beautiful before God. Don't you ever let nobody tell you different." These words sink deep into Fanny's young heart like seeds planted in fertile soil. Luella may not be able to read the words in books, but she can read the human heart with perfect clarity. She sees something special in her youngest daughter, a spark, a strength, a voice that will one day shake the world. Little Fanny nods solemnly, not yet understanding how prophetic these words will prove to be. But already, deep in her heart, something special is stirring. When the family gathers in the evening around the flickering kerosene lamp, and Fanny begins to sing spirituals in her clear, strong voice, the sound doesn't just fill their small room. It seems to lift the very walls, carrying their hopes and prayers up to heaven itself. Her voice possesses a quality that defies description, not just beautiful, but transcendent. When she sings "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot" or "Amazing Grace," even baby siblings stop crying to listen. Neighbors find excuses to walk past their house during evening prayer time, drawn by the sound of something holy emerging from that humble dwelling. The years pass quickly when you work from dawn to dusk, each day blending into the next in an endless cycle of cotton and survival. By age 8, Fanny can pick 100 pounds a day. By 10, she's keeping pace with teenagers. At 12, the decision is made for her. Fanny leaves school forever. The family needs another full-time worker, and her education becomes a luxury they cannot afford. but the voice remains, growing stronger with each passing year. In the little Baptist church, where wooden pews creak under the weight of worshipers and the tin roof leaks during rainstorms, Fannie sings so beautifully that tears flow down the congregation's faces like summer rain. Her voice carries pain and hope in equal measure. The sound of a people who have endured centuries of suffering yet refuse to surrender their faith. That child is marked by God. The old women whisper to each other, fanning themselves with cardboard funeral home fans while they shake their heads in wonder. The Lord's got plans for that voice. They don't know how right they are. Chapter 2. Love, Loss, and the Seeds of Rebellion. In 1944, when Fannie is 27 years old and has spent over 2 decades in the cotton fields, love finds her in the form of Perry "Pap" Hamer. He's a tractor driver on the same plantation. A quiet man with gentle hands and a kind smile that makes her feel beautiful despite her work-worn appearance. Their courtship is simple: stolen conversations during lunch breaks, shared glances across the church pews, walks along the dusty roads after Sunday service. Their wedding is a celebration of pure love over material circumstances. A white dress Fannie sews herself from flour sacks, carefully removing every trace of the manufacturer's logo. A bouquet of wildflowers, picked from the roadside, and the same church where she's sung all her life, now witnessing her vows. The reception is held in the church fellowship hall, with fried chicken, cornbread, and sweet tea served on mismatched plates, donated by church members. Pap works as one of the few black tractor drivers on the plantation, a position that carries slightly more respect and marginally better pay than field work. Fannie continues picking cotton, but now she dreams of more than just survival. She dreams of children, of a little house they might someday own, of simple human happiness that seems possible when love enters your life. But fate has prepared a series of cruel tests that will reshape Fannie's understanding of suffering and strength. Children come and go like brief, precious gifts, miscarriages that leave her body weak and her heart shattered, stillbirths that teach her the particular agony of holding a baby who will never draw breath, the kind of pain that has no words in any language. Each loss carves something deeper into Fannie's soul, a hollow place that fills not with bitterness, but with an expanding capacity for compassion. She begins to understand that her suffering connects her to every woman who has ever lost a child, every mother who has known the weight of empty arms. The final blow comes when Fannie goes to the Sunflower City Hospital about a small fibroid tumor. She trusts the white doctors, believing their promises of a simple procedure. But when she wakes from anesthesia, she discovers they have performed a complete hysterectomy without her knowledge or consent. The chance to become a mother has been stolen from her forever. They do this to many of our women, explains Dr. Robert Smith, one of the few African American doctors in the region, when Fannie seeks him out for the truth weeks later. His voice carries the weight of countless similar stories. They call it family planning, but we know better. It's population control, plain and simple. In those days, the forced sterilization of black women was so common across the South that medical professionals grimly referred to it as Mississippi appendectomy. Fannie learns she is one of thousands of black women whose reproductive choices were stolen by a medical system that saw their bodies as objects to be controlled, rather than human beings deserving of dignity and choice. The grief that follows is deeper than any physical pain Fannie has ever known. She weeps for her unborn children, for her stolen womanhood, for the cruelty of a world that can take away a woman's most fundamental dreams without even asking permission. For weeks, she cannot bring herself to sing in church, her voice seemingly broken along with her heart. But tears, no matter how bitter, don't last forever. Love finds a way to grow, even in the most wounded soil. When Fannie and Pap learn of two little girls in need of a home, Dorothy Jean and Virgie Ree, they open their hearts without hesitation. The girls, products of the same poverty and broken systems that define life in rural Mississippi, find in Fannie and Pap the stability and love they've never known. Maternal love, as it turns out, doesn't depend on whether you carried a child beneath your heart for 9 months. Fannie discovers that love is not diminished by being chosen rather than biological. If anything, it becomes more intentional, more precious. She pours into these girls all the dreams she held for her own children, teaching them the same lessons Mama Luella taught her. That they are human beings of infinite worth, regardless of what the world might tell them. The girls call her Mama, and when they do, something healing happens in the broken places of Fannie's heart. She realizes that motherhood is not just about giving birth, but about nurturing, protecting, and preparing the next generation for a better world than the one you inherited. For 18 years, Fannie and Pap live at a small house on the Marlowe plantation, 2 rooms that shelter their family and their dreams. Life flows in its established rhythm. Work before sunrise, fields during the day, family time in the evening, church on Sunday. Fannie thinks this pattern will continue until old age takes them, the same way it took her parents and grandparents. But destiny is preparing a meeting that will shatter this rhythm forever. August 18th, 1962. The date will be burned into Fannie's memory for the rest of her life. It's a sweltering Sunday afternoon when even the air seems heavy with moisture and possibility. A battered car pulls up to their house, dust swirling in its wake, and young people step out, activists from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, their faces bright with the kind of passion Fannie hasn't seen in years. Leading them is James Foreman, a young man whose eyes burn with righteous fire. And beside him stands James Bevel, whose presence commands attention despite his youth. They've come to Ruleville as part of a broader campaign to register Black voters across the Mississippi Delta, knowing that political power is the key to dismantling the systems that keep their people in poverty and fear. Mrs. Hamer, James Foreman says, his voice respectful but urgent. Do you know you have the right to vote? The question hits Fannie like a physical blow. The right to vote? In all her 45 years, no one has ever suggested such a thing. She's been told countless times what she cannot do, where she cannot go, what dreams she cannot pursue, but no one has ever spoken to her about rights she actually possesses. I've never thought about it, she answers honestly, her voice barely above a whisper. But even as she speaks, something is stirring deep inside her, like a long sleeping giant beginning to wake. The young activists explain the 15th Amendment, passed nearly a century earlier, guaranteeing the right to vote regardless of race. They describe the elaborate systems Mississippi has created to circumvent this constitutional guarantee. Literacy tests designed to be impossible, poll taxes that put voting beyond the reach of the poor, registration offices that are mysteriously closed whenever Black people approach. The vote is the most powerful tool we have. Bevel explains, his words carrying the weight of conviction. Without it, we're always going to be begging for crumbs from other people's tables. With it, we can set our own places at the table. Something awakens in Fannie that cannot be put back to sleep. Maybe it's the accumulation of a lifetime of indignities. Maybe it's the thought of her daughters growing up in the same system that has crushed generations of dreams. Maybe it's simply that 45 years of silence is enough. "I'll go," she says suddenly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'll go try to register." Chapter 3. The Point of No Return. 18 Black residents of Sunflower County board the bus that will take them to the courthouse in Indianola on August 31st, 1962. For most of them, including Fannie, it's the first time they've ever been inside a courthouse. The building looms before them like a fortress of white supremacy, all marble columns and intimidating architecture, designed to make people like them feel small and unwelcome. The group enters together, but each person faces the literacy test alone. Fannie is handed a section of the Mississippi Constitution and asked to interpret a passage about de facto laws, legal language that would challenge many college graduates, let alone a woman whose formal education ended at age 12. She stares at the words, trying to make sense of legal terminology she's never encountered. The white clerk watches her with barely concealed amusement, as if her failure is both expected and entertaining. Despite her best efforts, despite her intelligence and life experience, the test is designed to be impossible for someone with her educational background. "I'm sorry," the clerk says, with false politeness, "but you didn't pass." But even in failure, something profound has happened. For the first time in her life, Fannie Lou Hamer has demanded something that belongs to her by right. She has looked the system of white supremacy in the eye and said, "I deserve to be counted." The bus ride home is quiet. Each person lost in their own thoughts about what they've just experienced. But for Fannie, the silence is not defeat. It's the quiet before a storm. That storm breaks when they return to Ruleville. Word travels fast in small towns, especially when Black people do something as radical as attempting to vote. By the time the bus drops them off, plantation owner W.D. Marlowe already knows about Fannie's actions. The summons comes that evening. Fannie is called to the big house, the White House with columns and manicured lawns, where she's never been allowed inside. She walks the familiar path she's traveled thousands of times to work in the fields. But tonight it feels different, charged with possibility and danger. Marlowe stands on his porch like a feudal lord surveying his domain. He doesn't invite her to sit, doesn't offer her water despite the heat. The power dynamic is carefully maintained. She stands while he sits. She looks up while he looks down. "Fannie," he says, his voice carrying the authority of someone who has never been questioned by Black employees. "If you don't withdraw from this voting business, you'll have to leave my plantation tonight." The ultimatum hangs in the air between them like a blade. Fannie knows what this means. Not just the loss of their home, but the loss of their livelihood, their security, everything they've built over 18 years. In rural Mississippi in 1962, being expelled from a plantation as troublemakers means becoming economic outcasts. but something has awakened in Fannie that cannot be put back to sleep. Standing before this man who has controlled her life for 18 years, she feels a strength she's never known before. "Mr. Marlowe," she says, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel that surprises them both. "I didn't go down there to register for you. I went down there to register for myself." These words will become legendary in civil rights history, quoted in books and speeches for generations to come. But in that moment, they simply represent one woman's decision to claim her humanity, regardless of the cost. The reaction is swift and brutal. That same night, while Fannie and Pat pack their belongings by lamplight, shots are fired into the home where their friends have given them temporary shelter. The message is clear. This is what happens to people who get ideas above their station. They spend the next several days moving from house to house, their friends risking their own safety to provide temporary shelter. The economic pressure is immediate and severe. Pap loses his job, and other plantation owners in the area are warned not to hire them. They become refugees in their own hometown, casualties of their own courage. But Fannie doesn't waver. Instead of retreating, she doubles down on her commitment to voting rights. She returns to the courthouse again and again, each time facing the same impossible literacy test, each time refusing to be discouraged by failure. The harassment escalates. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, threatening to kill her and her family. Cars driving slowly past wherever they're staying. Occupants staring with undisguised hostility. Shots fired into houses where they're known to be staying. Instead of breaking her spirit, each act of intimidation strengthens Fannie's resolve and clarifies her understanding of what they're fighting against. This isn't just about voting. It's about human dignity, about the right to exist as a full person in American society. In January 1963, after multiple attempts, Fannie finally passes the literacy test. The victory is sweet but bittersweet. She knows that her success came only because the civil rights movement's legal challenges have begun to force changes in how the tests are administered. She is among the first Black residents of Sunflower County to successfully register to vote in decades. Now she's not just attempting to vote, she's actually registered, making her an even bigger threat to the established order. But Fannie has crossed a line from which there is no return. She has tasted political power, and she wants more. Not for herself, but for her people. Chapter 4. Finding her voice. With her voting registration finally secured, Fannie becomes a full member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She discovers that she has a gift for organizing and speaking that rivals her musical abilities. When she addresses small groups of Black farmers and domestic workers, her words carry the authority of lived experience, combined with a newfound understanding of political strategy. Her first speaking engagement is at a small church in Indianola, where she addresses an audience of about 30 people. Standing at the same pulpit where she's sung countless spirituals, Fannie finds that speaking truth is another form of song. "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired," she tells the audience, a phrase that will become her signature. "We've been patient long enough. We've been praying long enough. Now it's time to act." The response is electric. People who have lived their entire lives accepting limitations suddenly see alternatives. Fannie's message is simple but revolutionary. You have power, you have rights, and you have the responsibility to use both. Word of her speaking ability spreads quickly through the network of activists working across the South. Soon she's traveling throughout Mississippi, speaking at churches, community centers, and mass meetings. Her message is always the same. Voting is not just a right, but a responsibility, and political power is the key to changing the conditions that keep Black families in poverty. She develops a speaking style that combines the emotional power of the spirituals she grew up singing with hard facts about voter registration and political organizing. Her presentations often begin with singing, her voice still capable of filling any space and moving any audience, before transitioning to practical information about registration procedures and voter education. But her most powerful tool is her personal story. When she tells audiences about being thrown off the plantation for trying to vote, about the forced sterilization, about the daily indignities of life under Jim Crow, she's not just sharing information. She's bearing witness to the lived experience of oppression in ways that make abstract political concepts concrete and personal. The work is dangerous and exhausting. She travels on buses through hostile territory, stays in homes of local activists who risk their own safety by providing shelter, and speaks in churches that could be bombed for hosting civil rights meetings. The pay is minimal. SNCC activists survive on subsistence wages supplemented by donations from supporters. But Fannie has found her calling. But the most terrible test of her commitment awaits in June 1963. Chapter 5. Trial by Fire. Fannie is returning from a civil rights workshop in Charleston, South Carolina, where she's been learning techniques for voter education and community organizing. The workshop was hosted by Septima Clark, a legendary educator who has developed programs for teaching literacy and voting rights throughout the South. For Fannie, it's been a revelation, the chance to learn from other activists, to understand that the work she's doing in Mississippi is part of a broader movement spanning the entire region. On the bus ride home, she travels with a group of activists, including Anil Ponder, a respected SNCC worker, and several other civil rights workers. The group is tired but energized by the workshop, sharing ideas about how to implement new strategies in their home communities. The bus makes a routine stop in Winona, Mississippi, a small town that seems no different from dozens of others they've passed through. Some members of the group decide to use the restroom and get food from the bus station restaurant. In the segregated South, this requires using the colored facilities. But some of the younger activists decide to test the integration of the bus station by attempting to enter the whites-only restaurant. The reaction is swift and violent. Local police, apparently tipped off about the civil rights workers on the bus, are waiting. They arrest the activists who entered the white restaurant, then search the bus and arrest Fannie and others simply for being associated with the group. Fannie has done nothing more than sit on a bus, but she finds herself handcuffed and thrown into the Winona City Jail. The building is a concrete block structure that seems designed to break spirits as much as to hold prisoners. The cells are small, hot, and overcrowded, with inadequate sanitation and no air conditioning, despite the oppressive Mississippi heat. What happens next will haunt Fannie for the rest of her life and become one of the most notorious incidents of police brutality in civil rights history. The sheriff, a man whose eyes seem to hold personal hatred for everything Fannie represents, looks at this middle-aged woman with disgust. Here's someone who's getting uppity, who doesn't know her place in the carefully maintained racial hierarchy of Mississippi. "We're going to make you wish you'd stayed home," he tells her. They force 2 black prisoners, men who know what will happen to them if they refuse, to beat Fannie with a metal blackjack. The men's faces are filled with anguish as they're compelled to become instruments of torture against their will. This is part of the psychological torture, forcing Black people to participate in their own oppression. The beating begins. Fannie screams, begs for mercy, tries to protect herself, but the blows don't stop. The blackjack, a weapon designed to inflict maximum pain without leaving obvious external wounds, strikes her back, her legs, her kidneys, with methodical brutality. "Please," she whispers during one of the brief pauses. "I'm a Christian woman. I'm not a troublemaker." But her pleas only seem to encourage more violence. This isn't just a beating. It's a ritual of domination designed to break her spirit and send a message to every other Black person who might consider challenging the system. For 3 days, the torture continues. The beating is accompanied by psychological abuse, threats against her family, promises that she'll never leave the jail alive, descriptions of what will happen to other activists if they don't stop their activities. Fannie sustains severe kidney damage that will affect her for the rest of her life. A blood clot forms behind her left eye, partially blinding her. Her legs are so damaged that she will walk with a limp forever. But perhaps worst of all, the perpetrators have tried to break something deeper, her sense of her own worth, her belief that resistance is possible. But even in this hell, something miraculous happens. Fannie's voice doesn't break. Between beatings, she sings spirituals, not loudly, but with a quiet strength that carries through the jail. Her songs give courage to other prisoners, remind them that they are human beings deserving of dignity, even in this place designed to strip away every vestige of humanity. This little light of mine becomes her anthem during those dark days. Her voice, though weakened by pain, carries the same power it always has, the power to transform suffering into strength, despair into hope. When news of the beatings finally reaches the outside world, civil rights organizations mobilize to secure the activists' release. But the damage has been done. Fannie emerges from the Winona jail permanently changed, not broken, but forged into something harder and more determined. "They beat me until I was hard," she will say later, her voice carrying no self-pity, only a steely determination, hard as a rock. The physical pain will stay with her forever. But something else has happened in that jail cell. The woman who emerges is transformed, not by hatred, but by an unshakable understanding that the system she's fighting against is even more brutal and unjust than she had imagined. Chapter 6, A Voice Before the World, 1964, becomes the year that transforms Fannie Lou Hamer from a local activist into a national symbol of the civil rights movement. The brutal beating in Winona has made her a living testament to the violence that underlies white supremacy. But it has also revealed her extraordinary courage and moral clarity to a broader audience. The year begins with an ambitious project called Freedom Summer, a campaign to bring hundreds of college volunteers, mostly white students from prestigious northern universities, to Mississippi to register Black voters and establish freedom schools that provide the education denied to Black children by the segregated school system. Fannie becomes one of the key organizers of this effort, helping to coordinate logistics and serving as a mentor to the young volunteers who arrive that summer. Many of these students have never experienced the Deep South before, and Fannie helps them understand both the dangers they face and the communities they're trying to serve. But even as Freedom Summer brings national attention to Mississippi, Fannie and other local activists recognize that real change requires Black political power, not just white sympathy. This understanding leads to one of the most important political innovations of the civil rights era, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Working with other activists, including Annie Devine, Victoria Gray, and Aaron Henry, Fannie helps create a parallel political party that embodies the democratic values the official Mississippi Democratic Party has abandoned. The MFDP is open to all citizens, regardless of race, committed to economic justice as well as civil rights, and determined to represent the true interests of Mississippi's people. The formation of the MFDP is more than a political strategy. It's an act of creative resistance that imagines what democracy could look like if it actually included everyone. The party holds its own primary elections, drafts its own platform, and selects its own delegates to represent Mississippi at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. Fannie emerges as one of the party's most effective spokespersons. Her combination of moral authority and speaking ability making her a natural choice to represent the delegation. She campaigns tirelessly throughout Mississippi, speaking at mass meetings and explaining why Black political participation is essential for change. "We're not asking for handouts," she tells audiences. "We're asking for what's already ours, the right to participate in the democracy we help support with our taxes and our labor." The MFDP's challenge comes to a head at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey, in August 1964. The party sends an integrated delegation of 68 people to challenge the seating of the all-white official Mississippi delegation. It's a bold strategy designed to force the National Democratic Party to choose between its racist Southern wing and its stated commitment to civil rights. August 22, 1964, becomes one of the most important days in American political history. Fannie appears before the convention's Credentials Committee to present the MFDP's case. She knows that her words will be broadcast on national television, reaching millions of Americans who have never heard the truth about life in Mississippi. Standing at the podium in a simple dress, her hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment, Fannie begins, "My name is Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and I live at 626 East Lafayette Street, Ruleville, Mississippi, Sunflower County, the home of Senator James O. Eastland and Senator Stennis." The reference to the two senators is deliberate. These men represent Mississippi in the U.S. Senate while supporting the very system that denies representation to 40% of the state's population. What follows is 15 minutes of the most powerful political testimony in American history. Fannie tells her personal story, the poverty, the forced sterilization, the beating in Winona. But she frames it as part of a larger story about democracy denied and human dignity trampled. Her voice remains steady as she describes the beating. "I was carried to the county jail and put in the booking room. They left some of the people in the booking room and began to place us in cells. I was placed in a cell with a young woman called Miss Uvester Simpson. After I was placed in the cell, I began to hear sounds of licks and screams." She doesn't spare her audience the brutal details, understanding that Americans need to hear the truth about what happens to people who try to exercise their constitutional rights in Mississippi. The testimony builds to its climactic conclusion. All of this is on account of we want to register, to become first-class citizens. And if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hooks because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America? the convention hall falls silent. Delegates who had been conducting routine business stop what they're doing to listen. In hotel rooms across the country, Americans watching on television are confronted with a reality many have never imagined. President Lyndon Johnson, monitoring the coverage from the White House, recognizes the political threat immediately. Fannie's testimony is so powerful, so morally compelling, that it threatens to overshadow his own nomination and force uncomfortable questions about the Democratic Party's relationship with Southern segregationists. Johnson quickly calls an impromptu press conference to announce that he has chosen Hubert Humphrey as his running mate, knowing that breaking news will force television networks to cut away from Fannie's testimony. But the damage to the administration's preferred narrative has already been done. The political establishment's response reveals both the power and the limitations of moral suasion in American politics. Rather than seating the MFDP delegation, party leaders offer a compromise that exposes the gap between democratic rhetoric and political reality. The compromise, negotiated by Hubert Humphrey and other party leaders, offers the MFDP 2 at-large seats at the convention, not as representatives of Mississippi, but as general delegates without specific constituency representation. When Humphrey personally approaches Fannie to sell the compromise, conversation becomes a defining moment in her political education. "Mrs. Hamer," he says, with the patronizing tone of someone who believes he understands politics better than she does, "this is the best we can do right now." Fannie's response cuts to the heart of the matter. "Senator Humphrey, I know lots of people in Mississippi who have lost their jobs trying to register to vote. Now, if you lose this job of vice president because you do what is right, everything will be all right. God will take care of you." The MFDP delegation rejects the compromise in a vote that surprises even sympathetic observers. Fannie explains the decision in terms that reveal her sophisticated understanding of political power. "We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats when all of us is tired." Although the MFDP doesn't win official recognition in 1964, their challenge transforms American politics. More immediately, Fannie emerges from Atlantic City as a national figure whose moral authority transcends traditional political categories. Chapter 7: Beyond Voting Rights. The years following Atlantic City see Fannie's influence expand far beyond voting rights into broader questions of economic justice, women's rights, and international human rights. Her experience at the convention has taught her that civil rights and economic rights are inseparable, that political power without economic power is ultimately hollow. In 1969, she establishes the Freedom Farm Cooperative, a 640-acre agricultural cooperative designed to provide food security and economic independence for poor families in the Mississippi Delta. The cooperative represents Fannie's understanding that true freedom requires economic as well as political power. "A people with no food is a people with no power," Fannie explains to supporters who question why a civil rights leader is focusing on agriculture. "We have to feed our people before we can free our people." The cooperative faces constant financial challenges, securing loans from banks reluctant to support Black economic independence, finding markets for their produce, managing the complex logistics of collective agriculture. But it succeeds in providing food for hundreds of families and demonstrates that alternatives to poverty and dependence are possible. Fannie's work with the cooperative also reveals her growing feminist consciousness. Though she never uses the term feminist, her analysis of power increasingly focuses on the ways that poor Black women bear the greatest burden of economic and racial oppression. She begins speaking about the connections between civil rights and women's rights, understanding that the struggle for human dignity cannot be divided into separate categories. Women have got to stop being hypocrites, she tells audiences. We've got to stop talking about what we can't do and start talking about what we can do. When the Vietnam War escalates, Fannie becomes one of the first civil rights leaders to publicly oppose American military involvement. Her opposition is rooted in both practical and moral considerations. Why should young Black men go fight for democracy in Vietnam when they don't have democracy in Mississippi? She asks audiences. Her anti-war stance costs her support among some mainstream civil rights organizations, but she refuses to moderate her positions for political convenience. I'm not going to let anybody compartmentalize my moral convictions, she declares. Wrong is wrong, whether it's in Mississippi or Vietnam. Chapter 8. The Price and the Legacy. The constant stress of activism, combined with the physical damage from the Winona beating, begins to take its toll on Fannie's health in the early 1970s. The kidney damage from the 1963 beating leads to ongoing medical problems that are exacerbated by diabetes, high blood pressure, and heart disease. But even as her body weakens, her spirit remains indomitable. She continues traveling and speaking, though now she often needs assistance getting to and from the podium. The medical bills accumulate, adding financial stress to the physical pain. Despite her national prominence, Fannie has never earned significant money from her activism. Her role in the movement evolves from frontline activist to elder stateswoman and mentor. Young people seeking to understand the civil rights movement's history seek her out, and she generously shares her experiences and insights. Her home in Ruleville becomes a pilgrimage site for activists and ordinary people inspired by her story. But Fannie is careful not to romanticize the movement or her own role in it. I wasn't nobody special, she insists. I was just somebody who got tired of being tired and decided to do something about it. In 1971, she runs for the Mississippi State Senate, bringing her message directly to voters in her home district. Though she loses the election, the campaign demonstrates the political transformation she has helped achieve. A Black woman can now run for state office in Mississippi. In one of her last major speeches, delivered in 1976, she reflects, "We've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. The young people will have to carry this work forward, but they can build on the foundation we've laid." On March 14, 1977, at age 59, Fannie Lou Hamer dies in a hospital in Mound Bayou, Mississippi, surrounded by family and friends. She has lived long enough to see many of the changes she fought for, but not their full realization. Her final months are spent in and out of hospitals, her body finally succumbing to the accumulated damage of a lifetime of hardship and the specific injuries from the Winona beating. But even in her hospital bed, she continues to receive visitors and offer encouragement to those carrying on the work. When visitors expect heroic tales, she reminds them of the ordinary people who made extraordinary sacrifices, the anonymous supporters who provided food and shelter, the local leaders who never received national recognition. Her modesty reflects both genuine humility and understanding that social movements succeed through collective action rather than individual heroism. "Don't be looking at me," she tells audiences who seem overly focused on her individual courage. "Look at what we can do together." Her influence during these final years extends far beyond the formal civil rights movement. Feminist activists claim her as a foremother, recognizing her early articulation of the connections between racial and gender oppression. Labor organizers study her work with the Freedom Farm Cooperative as a model for community-based economic development. Anti-war activists cite her moral clarity about the connections between domestic and foreign policy. But perhaps her most important legacy is her demonstration that moral authority comes not from formal credentials or institutional position, but from lived experience and consistent principle. Fannie never attended college, never held elected office, never headed a major organization, yet her voice carried more weight than those of presidents and senators. This authority was earned through sacrifice and maintained through integrity. She paid the price for every moral stand she took, from losing her home for trying to vote to being beaten for teaching others their rights. But she never used her suffering to claim special privileges or to silence others' voices. As her health deteriorates, she faces the prospect of death with the same courage she brought to every other challenge in her life. She has no illusions about her mortality, but she also has no regrets about the choices she made. Her daughters, Dorothy Jean and Virgie Ree, now adults with families of their own, try to care for their adoptive mother while managing their own responsibilities. Even in her final weakness, Fannie continues to mentor young activists. "The young people are the hope," she says. "They have to carry this movement forward, but they can build on the foundation we've laid." Her understanding that social change is a generational project requiring constant renewal guides her final conversations with visitors. Each generation must find its own ways to challenge injustice while building on the achievements of those who came before. The irony is bitter, but not lost on those who love her. The woman who spent her life fighting for economic justice struggles to pay her own medical bills. Supporters organize fundraising efforts, but they're not enough to cover the mounting costs of treating her complex health problems. Yet Fannie refuses to become bitter or cynical. Her faith, tested by decades of struggle and personal loss, remains unshaken. God's time is not our time. She reminds visitors who grow impatient with the slow pace of change. But God's time is always right time. Epilogue. The song continues. The funeral of Fannie Lou Hamer becomes a celebration of a life lived with purpose and a recommitment to the values she embodied. Thousands of people gather in Ruleville and the surrounding area to pay their respects. Civil rights veterans, current activists, politicians, and ordinary citizens whose lives were touched by her example. The service is held at the same church where she first sang spirituals as a child, bringing her life full circle. The wooden pews that once creaked under the weight of sharecroppers now hold congressmen and senators, testament to the political transformation she helped achieve. But the most important mourners are the local people, farmers, domestic workers, the poor and dispossessed, who saw in Fannie Lou Hamer not just a leader, but a sister. The eulogies capture different aspects of her legacy: her courage, her compassion, her unwavering commitment to justice, her ability to see the humanity in everyone she encountered. Andrew Young, then serving as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, speaks for many when he says, "None of us has done more for our country than Fannie Lou Hamer." But perhaps the most fitting tribute is the singing, as her voice had once lifted spirits in this same sanctuary. Now hundreds of voices join together in the spirituals she loved. "This little light of mine, we shall overcome. Precious Lord." Their combined sound carries the same message of hope and determination that her individual voice had conveyed for decades. The processional to the cemetery becomes a final march for freedom, with mourners walking the dusty roads of Ruleville where Fannie once campaigned for voting rights. Children who have grown up in a world where Black people can vote, where segregation is illegal, where opportunities exist that Fannie could only dream of, follow the hearse carrying the woman who made their freedom possible. Her tombstone in Ruleville Cemetery bears a simple inscription, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." The words that became her signature now mark her final resting place, a reminder that sometimes the most profound truths can be expressed in the simplest language. But Fannie Lou Hamer's true monument is not carved in stone. It's written in the changed laws, the opened opportunities, the expanded consciousness of what democracy can mean when it includes everyone. Every Black person who votes without fear, every woman who speaks truth to power, every poor person who demands dignity, carries forward some part of her legacy. Her story reminds us that the most powerful voice in America can belong to the most unlikely person, a sharecropper's daughter who never lost faith in the promise of democracy, even when that democracy failed her repeatedly. She proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite that fear. In our current moment, when democracy again faces challenges and voices of hatred seek to drown out voices of hope, Fannie Lou Hamer's example remains urgently relevant. She showed us that one person, armed with truth and sustained by love, can indeed change the world. The cotton fields of Mississippi are still there, but they no longer hold the same power over the people who worked them. Black farmers can own their land, send their children to integrated schools, vote for representatives who look like them. That transformation didn't happen automatically. It required the sacrifices of people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who were willing to risk everything for change. Her voice, that magnificent instrument that began by singing spirituals in Mississippi cotton fields and ended by challenging the conscience of a nation, continues to echo through the generations. In every person who refuses to accept injustice, who speaks up for those who cannot speak for themselves, who believes that the arc of the moral universe does indeed bend toward justice. In all of these, the voice of Fannie Lou Hamer lives on. The little girl who once stood on a sharecropper's porch watching the sun rise over cotton fields grew up to help America see a new dawn of possibility. Her song of freedom continues in every heart that refuses to be silenced, in every voice raised against oppression, in every person who dares to believe that change is possible. When young activists today face seemingly impossible odds, when the forces arrayed against justice seem too powerful to overcome, when the slow pace of change breeds despair, they can look to Fannie Lou Hamer's example for strength. She faced down sheriffs and senators, plantation owners and presidents, secure in the knowledge that right is right and wrong is wrong, regardless of who holds power. Her legacy is not just in the specific victories she achieved, the voting rights, the political changes, the economic opportunities. Her deepest legacy is in the demonstration that ordinary people possess extraordinary power when they find their voice and use it for justice. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of Fannie Lou Hamer's extraordinary life, that ordinary people, when they find their voice and use it for justice, can accomplish things that seem impossible. Her legacy is not just what she achieved, but what she showed us we can achieve when we refuse to accept that things must always be as they have been. The voice that could not be silenced still speaks to us across the decades, reminding us that freedom is not a destination, but a journey, that democracy is not a guarantee, but a responsibility, and that justice is not inevitable, but possible, if we have the courage to claim it. In every generation, new voices must rise to carry forward the work of justice. Some will speak from podiums and pulpits, others from factory floors and farm fields. Some will write laws, others will challenge them. But all can draw inspiration from the woman who proved that the most important qualification for leadership is not education or wealth or position, but the willingness to stand up and say, "This is wrong, and I will not be silent." Fannie Lou Hamer's song continues in every heart that chooses courage over comfort, justice over ease, truth over convenience. Her voice echoes in every person who remembers that change is possible, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is one person who simply refuses to give up. The voice that could not be silenced speaks still, calling us to remember that in America, every voice matters, every person counts, and every generation must fight anew for the promises of democracy. Her legacy is not just history, it is hope, carried forward by all who dare to believe that a better world is possible.